Okay, now everything is fine. Thank you very much, Magda, for such a warm presentation of me, for such invitation, and for creating of this research platform, which is incredibly important in our not only country, but the whole region. Okay, dear all, I would like to share my screen and share my presentation. Please let me know if you can see my presentation. Okay, some problem with my computer, but everything is okay. Please confirm if everything is okay.
Yes, it is.
Super. So let's come to our main topic for today, which are autobiographies of people with disabilities in Poland in specific time of Polish history, which is period between the end of the Second World War, 1945, and beginning of political, economic, and social transformation in Poland in 1989. So in Polish People's Republic, communist Poland, when Poland was socialist republic. I'm trying to switch to another post. Magda already introduced me to you. So just shortly, I work at Faculty of Polish Studies at Jagiellonian University in Kraków, in Poland. I'm author, scholar, and translator. But I will not develop this topic because I already introduced by Magda. Okay. Why I'm talking today about this period? Why this time in history of these people with disabilities, not only in Poland, but in Central and Eastern Europe, is so important? Why I'm talking about communist Poland? I can say, based on my current research, that this is one of the most important time in the history of people with disabilities in our country, and we still face with consequences of some phenomena which appeared in that years. First reason is that in this time, people with disabilities first in the history of Poland gained possibility to get free and available for everyone education, at least on paper, at least in theory. This education was for free, first time in the history of Poland, first time in the history this education was not only available, but everyone just needed to finish school to get education. I can share with you such a personal story that in my family history, there was a person who would attend to elementary school. This person lived in village in agriculture family. I can say that this person got first time the possibility in her life to gain the ability to read and write. In 1952, officially, a communist government in Poland claimed that illiteracy in Poland disappeared, including people with disabilities. Of course, it was theory. In practice, this education wasn't available for everyone. There was a lot of problems in supporting people with disabilities in Polish schools. I can say also, based on my researches from 2013 and 2014, that I've gained some interviews with people with disabilities who remember those times, that discrimination against people with disabilities in schools was terrible in that time, even including people with not heavy types of disabilities, with some chronic diseases like epilepsy. Schools were totally not prepared for providing education for children and young adults with disabilities. But in theory, this education became free for everyone, available and compulsory for everyone living in Polish People's Republic. What is another important phenomenon which appeared in that period and why it's important? In that time, there was there appeared growing gap between religious and secular view on disability. Polish People's Republic on the surface was secular state. And we know from our history that, for example, in 1950s, 1960s, there was some conflict between government and clergy, not only Roman Catholic Church, it was also a problem for minority churches and for minority religions in Poland. However, since the election of Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II in 1978, we see more and more growing gap between religious and secular view on disability, which we can see even today. What else? In that time, we had statements about welfare state. So we can see that there was quite good comparing even with 21st century support, financial and economic support of people with disabilities. Of course, this support wasn't perfect. I will tell it about it more, but depending on several researches and depending on basing on some observations, we can say that people with disabilities were one of those groups which lost during the transformation of late 1980s and 1990s. In that time, we faced also development of medicine and technology. Yes, our borders were closed. Not everyone could go abroad. Getting passport was very difficult. It needed a lot of effort and sometimes also cooperation with communist services. But generally, we also were part of Europe. We are also part of development, rapid development in medicine and technology. I will connect it with phenomenon of this gap between religious and secular view on disability. I would say that this year, 1945, 1989 was this time when disability became out of magic, where disability became seen as phenomenon not connected with any supernatural ideas, not connected with any supernatural beings. And what's also very important, the last but not the least, first signs of Polish, maybe even Central European, maybe Eastern European, I don't have such data, so maybe there were also other signs. Some rules of disability studies began in 1970s. Later, I will tell you more about signs of it in one of those books I will talk about soon. But for example, in 1973, there was a conference in Białystok about functioning of people with disabilities in rural environment. Why it is important? In this publication, in this monograph, which was published after this conference, I found quite modern observations. For that time, it was really modern. For example, authors of this monograph gave up writing about people with disabilities as invalids. Instead of that, they start to use words like people with disabilities. So they started to think in different way about disability and about people with disabilities. And they also started to think about disability as more a social phenomenon than medical one. So that's why this time is very important in the so-called Polish history of disability. However, before I will start to talk more about it, I would like to introduce you shortly into state which existed before the Second World War. Why I'm talking about it? It's obvious. It's not like that things didn't look like didn't look in that way that some phenomenon started to exist just after the war. No. I'm introducing to you Maria Grzegorzewska, who was a teacher, activist in 1920s, who introduced idea of equality and justice in education. However, before war, her ideas didn't meet with understanding and with wide acceptance. I would like also to introduce you a special place, a very specific place in Mazowieckie voivodeship. It's Laski. It's a small settlement close to Warszawa, where in this time, before Second World War, was opened quite modern for that time, Center of Education for Blind Children and Teenagers, for children and teenagers with the sight disability. I'm talking about it because this place was also very important in 1950s and 1960s. And it was a really inclusive space in that time. So inclusive that not only children and teenagers with sight disability could study there, but it was also a place prepared for providing education for people for young people with other types of disability. And this place was really inclusive in that times, also after war. As I mentioned, ideas of Grzegorzewska about equality and justice in education for everyone, including children with mental disabilities, wasn't accepted, which was seen in 1924 during the Teachers' Council. In 1919, we started to establish Veteran Society in Poland. Disability before and during Second World War was connected usually with hard work conditions, physical work, especially in agriculture, but also by some common, in that times, diseases like tuberculosis, typhus, syphilis, measles, pertussis. I will not count everything, every of such of disease. But it's important to remember that disability before and just after Second World War was common, I would say, daily life experience. Majority of people who lived in rural areas, especially in rural areas, or people who belonged to poorer social classes in urban environments, didn't have any insurance. And it also made their state worse because they couldn't afford for even very easy for contemporary times and in that times treatment. There are pictures of the center in Laski in the past before war. On the left, we can see the photo of this building belonging to the center, and a contemporary photo from 21st century. Now I'm coming to disability in Poland after Second World War. As I mentioned, just after the war, it was common experience of daily life. People with disabilities were seen everywhere. I would not exaggerate if I would say that in every family there was person with disability. However, in that time, disability became a concern of politics. I'm talking about it also in the context of research made by Ministry of Health on the turn of 1948 and 1949. Those results showed that 70% of children in that time had contact with tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was also important phenomenon in that time connected with disability. tuberculosis was also often cause of disability. And soon I will show you how social environment, social interactions made people with tuberculosis disabled. So we have also disabling society in that time. A very common disease in that time was also rickets. A lot of children was undernourished. A lot of families had problems with gaining enough and good quality food. And that was cause of many disabilities, especially among children. So-called rheumatism, I know that it's not proper and not really scientific term, but I'm mentioning it because it was used in Polish language. Rheumatoid arthritis was common condition of young people in post-war Poland. In 1949, 2% of children and young adults lived with rheumatoid arthritis. And I would mention some very important note from this report of Ministry of Health from 1949. First, those condition, rheumatoid arthritis, was named a social plague. So we see some stigmatization of people living with rheumatoid arthritis. And it's not enough, because in this report, we can read that people living with rheumatoid arthritis are called burden for societies. It's real stigmatization of such people. I would like to explain why people with disabilities were considered as a burden for society. First, I would like to mention specific rural mentality, which was connected with the fact that our agriculture after war was not only destroyed by war, and also it was backward comparing to Western Europe. People were still using very hard physical work. A person with disability usually wasn't able to do such work in agriculture. So for family with such kind of mentality, and I would like to remind that before the war, 70% of Polish society worked in agriculture. And also agriculture became this branch of economy, which was especially accepted by communist government. And there was a big emphasis on this part of economy. So a large part of Polish society in that time was thinking that people with disability aren't useful for family. And because they weren't considered as useful, many rural families were afraid of physical disability. It was also connected with the fact that physical kinds of disability were connected with contagious diseases like tuberculosis or polio. In 1950s, we had a big epidemic of polio. There is also evidences for it in Diaries of Rural Women and Nurses from the years 1945 and 1960. From those diaries, there are multiple diaries. Sometimes those women choose to be anonymous. Disability was caused mostly by infectious diseases like tuberculosis, often connected in that time by extreme poverty, addictions, and abuse. Especially children with disabilities were often abused and neglected. It was due to the fact that many parents of those children didn't have access to proper education, and they lived in poverty. It was also connected with general social demoralization during the war and post-war social conditions under Stalinist government. Now I will talk a little about ableism in post-war Poland and what could be possible causes. Just shortly before I will come to main topic. First of all, it was probably extreme poverty in the society and deprivation, fear of facing economic problems and even basic survival for the whole family. I mean, even access to food, even to clean water. Still in 1950s, we had local epidemic of typhus, which was connected with the lack of clean water to drink. It was connected with demoralization due to Nazi and Stalinist propaganda. Of course, it doesn't mean that all people were under the impact of that propaganda. But I would like to quote some of person who was talking about her feelings about LGBT people after war. And I would say that we can also apply it for people with disabilities in that time. This person told in her memories that she was under some influence of Nazi propaganda. So we can say that it also had some impact on society during 6 years of war. Also, Roman Catholic teachings on disability, especially before Second Vatican Council. Second Vatican Council in years 1962, 1966 opened the door for people with disabilities in Roman Catholic Church. I'm talking about Roman Catholic Church as dominating Christian church in Poland. I would say that church teaching about disability was far away from inclusive. After Second World War in Roman Catholic Church, there was a discussion about people with mental disabilities, and there were two sides of this conflict. One of those sides was more conservative and less inclusive toward people with mental disabilities and their activity in church lives. Second part was, I would say, more open-minded, more tolerant, more inclusive. To this second part of this, to the second side of this conflict belonged poet and Roman Catholic priest Jan Twardowski, who worked with children with mental disabilities and who strongly accepted their presence in church and in society, who strongly supported their activities and inclusion. Of course, I mentioned lack of proper education and lack of access to modern technology. This lack of access to and which was also connected with many barriers in daily life, it also caused. It also was one of the, on one side, we can say that it was one of many levels of ableism in post-war Poland, but it was also one of result of disabilism. And shortly, I would like also to introduce you into propaganda of that time. On the right side, you can see the poster from 1950s. Bimber, przyczyna ślepoty, Hooch, the case of blindness. Disability in that times became connected with social pathology, demoralization. We can see on this poster man who is person with disability, and his disability is clearly connected with alcohol abuse. From that time started this stereotype, the person with disability who is dependent on social care and who is connected with some social pathology. It's from that time, this propaganda created this myth and stereotype. Now I will tell something about experiences of disability in post-war Poland. There are several experiences described in autobiographies written and published in that time. One of them was tuberculosis. As I mentioned, tuberculosis was common disease after Second World War. And it was often connected with isolation, literal isolation from the society. It was described by Stanisław Grzesiuk and Danuta Bieńkowska. I will tell more about it soon. Disability was also caused by war injuries, and it was described by Michał Kaziów. Also by hard physical work in industry, accidents at work, especially in coal mines. It was a common phenomenon, especially in Silesia. I will talk more about it. Silesia is generally very interesting area in Poland, very interesting region in Poland. Well, also when we talk about history of disability and disability studies. Some of these elements of disability were described in Diaries of Miners from 1973. And also we have a description of disability which started in early childhood, which was connected with also poor experience of poor education and general social deprivation. It was described by Elżbieta Anna Łubińska, about whom I will tell you more soon. Okay. I would like to provide you general overview of autobiographies, which were written by people with disabilities in post-war Poland. What do they have common? What do they? There are some topics which are especially present in books written by such people. First of all, in all of those autobiographies, I noticed that they wrote about their family and friendships as special value. It's not surprising because in some cases, disability was coming with social isolation. And also discrimination. This discrimination was also caused by still existing superstitions about different types of disability and also this propaganda I mentioned. Some of them describe some specific subculture. Maybe subculture is not a good word. But in some cases, people with disabilities created their own words, their own language, their own social rituals. Usually, those people and those authors, with some exceptions, didn't have any higher education. They finished they graduated just elementary school. There was one exception, Michał Kaziów. So this way they used simple language, but this is also very characteristic for those texts. Sometimes very simple language was mixed with medical descriptions. And this doesn't match to simple language used by authors. Always, in all cases, they wrote about very, very private, sometimes I would say even intimate issues. And those intimate issues, those private life, in those texts seems to be more important to authors than politics. It's paradox, but they lived in highly, I would say, politics times, and politics had impact on every area of daily life. But for them, sometimes like when I was reading those texts, I had impression that for most of them, politics doesn't matter at all. However, in those books, we can see also criticism of the society and social order. Even if this criticism isn't present directly, we can see a lot of such criticism. And it was also interesting. Sexuality and generally description of psychosexual experiences, including relationship with other people, is absent. If it appears, it is described by ribald, even vulgar language, for example, in jokes or allusions. And I also noticed that there are, in that time, there were two types of autobiographical narrations. First, were based on experiences from pre-war or wartime, and they were published after war. Second type was the experiences written after war and based on experiences during or after war. I would like to share with you first example. It is a book on the margins of life, Polish title Na marginesie życia, then by Stanisław Grzesiuk, published in 1964, shortly after death of author. Grzesiuk in that time was previously known as author of his autobiographical novels, Boso, ale w Ostrogach, which describe his pre-war experiences, and 5 lat kacetu, books describing his experiences from concentration camps. Very characteristic for all Grzesiuk narrations is sense of humor. Even in his last autobiographical novel, even in his autobiography on the margins of life, we can see a lot of sense of humor. He has very distance to his own experiences. And in his book, which describes his experiences from 1940s and 1950s, we can see tuberculosis as a very common experience of Polish society during and after war. Grzesiuk became sick and he got this tuberculosis when he was in concentration camp in Germany. He survived this camp, but he died because of TB, because of tuberculosis. Okay, now I will present you and let you know some information about how Grzesiuk described tuberculosis as cause and as some kind of disability. In first pages of his book On the Margins of Life, he directly wrote, "I can't breathe while walking up." It's very interesting because after he's coming back home from Germany, he wanted to live as average person, to not be different. As survivor of concentration camp, his life was heavy enough, it was difficult enough, and he wanted to come back a survivor to normal life, as we can say. However, he noticed in 1946, it was in 1946, that he has problems with breathing, and he started to have heavy cough. It was first moment he connected it with smoking. However, when he started to have more and more problem, and when he noticed that also his child started to be sick, he went to doctor. This doctor diagnosed him with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was connected with literal physical weakness, especially experience of fever. He needed to put more and more effort into his daily life. He described with all details operation, cutting the rib to make space for air in lungs. He described also discrimination at work, and he also wrote a lot about hypocrisy of society. He criticized society because he noticed that people were afraid of people openly living with tuberculosis. But he also noticed that when he told anyone about his condition, people were afraid of him. They started to keep more and more distance from him. He noticed that he lost almost all his friends who were his friends before coming out as a person with tuberculosis and coming out with person with disability. Of course, disability in communist Poland became more and more institutionalized. He finally lost his job because his boss didn't want anymore to work with person who could infect anyone with such disease. However, Grzesiuk criticized him that he's afraid of him, person who is under any treatment, and the same person isn't afraid of people who even don't know about their condition and can really infect other people. And even if they know about their condition, they don't speak about it. I also noticed a very vivid description of children with severe tuberculosis and its complications, like brain damage due to tuberculosis. It's interesting that Grzesiuk also described them using language which is far away from any inclusion, as I say. Okay. Experience of Grzesiuk, described in his book, consists also description of sanatorium as space for people living with chronic disease and disability. I would only say that this conception of such place is very old, rooted in antiquity. And first modern sanatorium was opened in Sokołowsko in Poland. It was sanatorium for people living with tuberculosis. Of course, some of them were described in Grzesiuk's autobiography. Zakopane, it's Otwock, Busko-Zdrój. Grzesiuk in very big details described the fear of disability and disease in post-war Poland. Not only problems with keeping job and contacts with co-workers, also family issues. He noticed that people who were staying in sanatorium half year or even longer time, many of them became single or divorced because such a long isolation caused a breakdown of relationships and many disturbations in family life. Sometimes it was also cause of many dramas, like separation of parents from their children. He also described severe pain and lack of normal social rituals, especially absence of alcohol. I'm talking about alcohol because alcohol was element of daily life in communist Poland. Not only in Poland, of course, but alcohol after war was very commonly used. Also to forget about pain of daily life, about sorrows of daily life, about poverty. And in sanatorium, people with tuberculosis couldn't drink any alcohol. Some of them, however, some of them broke this rule and started to drink again. Instead of that, people living in sanatorium developed their own social rituals, like making special quizzes for newcomers, some initiation for rites of passage for people who are new in sanatorium. So it's very fascinating book in that context. This is sanatorium for people living with tuberculosis in Otwock, in Mazowieckie, in Poland. Now this building is in very bad conditions, as we can see in this photo. Otwock was one of the best places for people with tuberculosis in that time. There were a lot of specialists in that times. I'm coming to another author, Michał Kaziów, who published in 1985 a book Went to My Eyes, Gdy moim oczom, with Polish title. He lived in years 1925-2001. He lost his sight and two hands due to contact with lost bomb in October 1945. In 1964, he graduated Polish studies at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, and he was the first person with disability in Poland who got PhD in humanities in 1973. His dissertation was also very interesting, was focused on radio and radio art. Why radio? Radio was very important for Michał. Michał was very active listener in radio. He very often was contacting with Polish radio in 1950s, 1960s. He won several contests in radio, and in that time started his fascination on radio. Now I will say some words about experience of disability in Kaziów's case. First pages of his autobiographical books, except of description of his family living in eastern Poland and small village close to Lviv. Now it's Ukraine. He moved with his family after war to a small town close to Wrocław. Later he moved to Zielona Góra and to Poznań. When he got contact with a bomb, during which he lost his sight and two hands, he was focused on writing about pain, about severe pain. Severe pain, which was described as burning pain. Later he started to write about total dependence from family, even in relieving himself, even in wearing clothes. And that's why he started to feel not good enough. His self-esteem became very low. It was also connected with gossips from the side of neighbors who started to spread gossips that he is a person with disability and therefore he is not good enough, he is not useful, etc., etc. And in that time, radio became his, I would say, some way to regulate his emotions, and window to the world. Radio became his object of fascination. Radio became his the only way to get some news about the world. There is also described his adventure with gaining education with support and assistance of people who got via radio. Who he also mentioned his episode in Laski, where he could attend high school and then study at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And I noticed also very interesting detail in his autobiography. There was a sentence written by, it was in fact it was quote, nothing about us without us, which he heard about in 1950s and 1960s during summer vacation camps for young adults with disabilities. It's very interesting because I would say that that time he started to be more and more aware that there is alternative, that there is possibility to think differently about disability. I'll only shortly mention his high value of education. He wrote a lot about the role of education in his life as way of change. He noticed that if person with disability has access to education, it can really change life of such person. And education allows people with disabilities to gain independent life, truly independent life. Only shortly, I will mention Miners' memoirs by Bronisław Gołębiowski, published in 1973. It's a collection of memoirs of miners in Silesia, especially Upper Silesia. It's also important. Which was highly industrialized region in post-war Poland. There are very short mentions of disability. Usually it was disability got by work conditions and accidents, which were very common in coal mines in Upper Silesia. However, disability wasn't often described by texts of that time about Silesia. There are only some short mentions. There is only a short slide about disability in the context of miners' work and industry in Silesia. I would say that lack of other type of education pushed people who got disability due to accident during the work in coal mine. So it pushed them into the home life. They stayed at home. And I noticed that also in resources about disability in miners' life in Silesia, despite of high respect to people who got the disability due to hard work or accident in the coal mine, those people experienced very big respect in local community. Those people couldn't do some services in their local community. For example, one of those miners wrote that he has no courage, that he is not brave enough, for example, to show himself in church or do some services for local communities. Sometimes those people just didn't feel good enough to do it. They were used to think that they should stay at home. And sometimes, especially when they were older family members, to share their life experience to younger generations. But it was, in fact, the only accepted social activity. There is also one important fact that propaganda of that time and censorship didn't allow to talk openly about harmful impact of industry on the local community health. Especially there was a big scandal in 1980s connected with lead poisoning in Silesia. There is a picture of child with symptoms of lead poisoning. Lead poisoning was also common in some areas in Silesia, and it was also connected with some kinds of disability. However, doctors who wanted to report lead poisoning were made silent in media. They couldn't tell about it. Another author, Elżbieta Anna Łubińska, who was author of autobiography Salamander, in Polish Salamandra, published in 1986, is one of very few female authors I'm talking about, and who described disability experience from early childhood. The cause of her disability isn't known. She was paralyzed. She couldn't walk since very early childhood. And she wrote a lot about her intimate experiences of disability. She described her discussions with popular views on disability, both secular and religious. For example, she described her discussion with a nun who was visiting, with a Roman Catholic nun who was visiting her when she was a teenager. And this nun told her that her disability is like cross of Jesus Christ, and that God loves her especially because he gave to Elżbieta this cross of disability. Elżbieta answered in that time, if it's love, I don't want to have anything common with such God, and I don't want to have anything common with such love. And if it's love, I don't want to have anything common with it. So she was very skeptical. She became very skeptical and doubting in her beliefs. Despite later age, she became more active in church life. And there was important role of Roman Catholic Church in her life. especially in 1970s, it was also connected with changes in Roman Catholic Church in that times. She described also a gap between promised equality, for example, between reality and theory, especially propaganda. She noticed that in theory she could gain her education, but when she was staying in sanatorium, she described that in fact she didn't got any education. Teacher was just sitting close to children and doing her own stuff. Children were playing without any care, and it was the education. So Elżbieta graduated only elementary school, and she felt really badly with it. She noticed that she was thinking that it's impossible for her to gain any higher education. And she felt embarrassed that when she was 20 years old, she could only write and read and nothing else. One of her friends, however, he proposed her to gain high education and go to the school, even in that time, and get at least a short-term work. And this time, 1970s, was very empowering for her, because she could attain higher education and got some job. It also, this gaining job also was empowering for her. I noticed also that she wrote about abuse and neglect of children in hospitals, in sanatorium. She described with details lack of personal hygiene, lice epidemic in sanatorium. She also noticed that, especially for her, intimate experiences, private life was more important than politics. She even wrote, I'm not specialist in politics directly, when she started to describe martial law in Poland in years 1989, 1983. I would like also introduce you book People of Górka, Ludzie z Górki from 1973, written by Danuta Bieńkowska. Danuta Bieńkowska wasn't a person with disability. However, she was a doctor, and she collected memoirs of doctors and patients of sanatorium in Busko-Zdrój. Busko-Zdrój is located in Świętokrzyskie, voivodeship in Poland. This sanatorium was called Górka. I can translate it as a small mountain. There are memoirs from 1918 to 1962. There are descriptions of disability caused by tuberculosis and parents' neglect. I noticed especially one of those autobiographical narrations. A girl who was born before war, it was a teenage girl, living with tuberculosis and scoliosis. She described her year of life in special bed made from cast. It was connected with the fact that her spine was destroyed by tuberculosis and undernourishment. She described also loss of physical ability to walk, and then gaining again this gradual walking after time spent in this bed. Also, I noticed some similarity to Łubińska autobiography, like description of intimate topics, like use of urinal and neglect from the side of healthcare specialists. What's also interesting that this girl described books as way of escape from reality. This autobiographical narration is anonymous. That's why I don't provide the name of this girl. And this is the sanatorium, Górka, in Busko-Zdrój. I'm slowly coming to the end. What is those narrations have common with each other? I noticed that in those narrations, disability is very strictly connected with concrete disease or medical condition, even if it's caused by accident, war injury, or hard work. In those autobiographies, you can read a lot of medical language, some medical descriptions. It's connected also with the fact that in that times, disability was seen from the perspective of medical paradigm. Disability in these books is usually, at least temporarily, at least for some period of time, was connected with poverty, social deprivation, family issues, lack of or losing job, or lack of education. Those experiences are often described by people, by authors, by post-war authors with disabilities in Poland. I noticed also some criticism of the gap between state propaganda and reality, like in the case of Grzesiuk, Pienkowska, in the case of Łubińska also. It's also, I would suggest in that case to paraphrase feminist phrase, private is politic, private is public. In that case, private is more important than public. In experiences of people with disabilities in Poland, category of private seems to be more important than public. However, some of them, for example, in the final chapter of On the Margins of Life by Grzesiuk, there is description of discussion of survivors, of people who became friends in sanatorium, for people living with tuberculosis. And in that discussion, I noticed some elements of discussion about how to improve the life of people with disabilities in Poland, what to do for people with tuberculosis. However, in the end, they don't do anything because they don't believe that the change is possible. I noticed a criticism of popular misconceptions about disability in that time. Like, for example, some popular beliefs that disability is punishment from God, or quite opposite, that disability is gift from God. It was highly criticized by those authors. And what's also important, in those narratives, education is the way to win the independent life, and also write about personal experiences. Those people could write about what they experienced because they got ability to write and read. It was the basic condition to write about their personal experiences. What is different? I also was focused on differences between those texts. I noticed that in that times, disability which was caused by accident or hard work was more accepted in society than disability which was caused by infectious disease or some childhood experiences. Also that men with disabilities had more opportunities in society than women. Especially women with disabilities, where there was a belief that women with disabilities especially women, should stay at home. Also that female authors were more often focused on the emotions, affects, and intimate experiences than men. And also was interesting that disability among men was more often caused by work accidents. It was the case of coal mine workers in Silesia. I'm coming to the end, and I would say big thank you for attention. And I would like to start short discussion because I know that we don't have enough time. We have exactly 12, maybe 15 minutes. Okay, I would finish my presentation and give voice to Magda.
Thank you, Alicja, for your lecture and for sharing your work and your analysis with us. Do we have, just as Alicia said, I would like to open a discussion. We have something like 20 minutes for discussion, so there's, I hope, plenty of time to ask questions and talk. So I wonder if there is already anyone willing to ask the first question to break the ice. Okay, we have Kasia Ojrzyńska. Kasia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Alicia, for this lecture. I would just like to open perhaps a big topic that you addressed at the beginning of your talk. Namely, you talked a bit about this kind of a clash between the religious and the secular attitudes to disability in the period. That was the major focus of your talk. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about this clash of perspectives. First of all, well, you talked a lot about education, and so I would be very interested to learn more about, well, this clash of these perspectives in education and also in the text that you've analyzed.
Yes, I noticed a big clash in that time, which was more and more intensive with the time. It was seen especially after election in Vatican of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. I noticed especially Łubińska's text that John Paul II became important figure for people with disabilities in that time. I know that it's controversial now in 21st century, in 2022, it's a very controversial topic now. But I noticed that we should see different light experiences of people with disabilities in 1970s or 1980s, and differently now. There are two different realities, in fact. In communist times, in Polish People's Republic, especially women with disability were staying at home out of any interest. And in fact, the only bigger institution which accepted their presence in public was church, especially in the province, in small towns, in the village. Because we often forget that in that times, majority of Polish population lived in rural areas and small towns, not in big cities. It changed after transformation of 1990s. Okay, we had the development of Warsaw, Warsaw, Kraków, building of Nowa Huta in Kraków, etc., etc. However, majority of population were rural community. And it's not the secret that rural communities are more conservative. Rurally, they are more conservative than urban communities. Of course, it's not the rule, but usually in many researches, it appears in many topics, not only disability. If church was the only accepted place, the only socially accepted space for women with disability, for men also, but men at least had another options, another opportunities. But women with disabilities were really accepted only in church in that times. Roman Catholic Church, I've always think that Roman Catholic Church became institution, which also after changes of 1989, stolen spaces for people with disabilities in communist Poland. Especially we see from that time, sorry, I'm not Roman Catholic and I never was, so sorry if I'm saying something stupid right now, but I read from that perspective sermons of Karol Wojtyła. And for that times, I was also talking about it as, talking also as person, because I'm also a person with disability. And I just wanted to imagine what could feel people who were neglected by society, who were living in isolation, whose only window to world was TV or radio, was no internet, no social media. and they whose only socially accepted place was church. So it's not surprising that John Paul II became the idol, like celebrity in that times. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but when I was saying it from outsider perspective, they were seeing him as celebrity in that times. However, secular perspective was more and more medical. Disability in that time, as I noticed, became out of any magic, out of any supernatural ideas in official narrative. I also noticed that in that time became more and more growing up clash between private experiences of disability and public speaking about disability. Private experience of disability was connected with space of home and church, especially in rural environment. In urban areas, it looked a little differently because urban areas had more opportunities, and also it was connected with transport, with public transport. We often forget about many intersectional, many very deep connections. I would say that this gap still exists in Polish society. Maybe in younger generation, I don't see it. In Generation Z, so-called Generation Z, I don't see it. Also, younger people with disabilities are experiencing secularization, but elder generation still live very deeply in this religious paradigm, which is connected with thinking about disability as cross, as special gift from God, etc., etc. However, is the essence of this gap growing especially from 1970s. Disability was still considered as burden for society, quoting this report from 1949. Another perspective, it was considered as gift from God. So we see very complicated picture in that time and full of ambivalent feelings. This ambivalence is still present in our society. I hope that I tried to answer. And sorry if I said something stupid, because honestly, I'm saying I never was Roman Catholic. I'm not Roman Catholic, so I'm sorry if I'm saying something stupid.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I can see that Natalia is raising her hand, and then Camila. Natalia?
Yeah. Hi, thank you, Alicja, for your ambitious talk. I have two short comments and one question, so maybe I will start with my comments. First, I would like to address the thing that people with disabilities during state socialism in Poland did not write about politics. I think it's also a question of censorship and what could have been published openly. And those books were published actually in large numbers. They were quite popular since 1970s, especially. And the question is what could have been said and how. And in some sense, they were very critical and very political, I would say, but not in a way of course, you know. So that's just one short comment, at least that's, and I think that's really interesting what you said about rural areas and how, and I totally agree that most of Polish population, up until today, most of the people live actually in small towns, right? Not in big towns in Poland. That continues, but one thing is that I think you said in the beginning, and I'm curious, you know, what kind of materials, what kind of sources you used, that it was especially difficult for people in rural areas to live, because from my research, it was otherwise. Actually, those people were needed. Many of them did work. I know that might seem counterintuitive, but people with disabilities did work despite all the struggle and hardship. They were actually useful. They were less needed in the cities. I mean, you are right talking about transportation and intersectionality here, of course, but at the same time, at least, you know, I'm super curious about your materials. I think our research corresponds in many ways, but yeah, I just had a different vision, you know, and now I maybe have to rethink, and just my last, and that's the question is, it seems to me that state socialism is more than 40 years, but I know this is because of lack of time probably, but you talked about it as if it was one period. and it's not monolithic. If you could maybe say in your research, are there any differences in approach to disability, and especially the way people with disabilities wrote about their own experiences in the 60s and, for example, in the 80s, because that's 20 years of also big political changes, which maybe have not been addressed directly in the texts, but nevertheless, they were experienced by those people. So I'm curious how, you know, how over time those memoirs are changing, basically. That's my question. Thank you.
So it's a lot of things you taught, Natalia, and thank you that you mentioned it. I based on materials from the place I'm living now, from Silesia. Silesia is a very specific area, especially Upper Silesia. I'm not sure about Cieszyn Silesia, which is also another region, but this ethics, this culture of Silesia is another story. And I was basing also on diaries of nurses from 1950s and 1960s, who were describing real struggles of families from poorer, because it's also, you are right that it's not one period. You are right about it. And also society was also diverse. Those nurses were focused on experiences of the poorest and really poor social classes. Those people who didn't have any education at all, or very basic, very elementary. There was, for example, they described, for example, for me it was shocking that in 1950s there were such superstitions, that there were people who, for example, used cows' shit to treat measles or something like that. But I was shocked when I read some reports, even even when I'm thinking that some of those could be literary exaggeration, it was shocking for me. And also those reports from 1940s. And I noticed also that there was a gap between what was officially published and was spoken in private spaces, also by some activists, because this period is also, I would agree that it was also the time of growing activism. Maybe it wasn't activism understood in contemporary way. Some kind of activism I noticed also before war. Also started some kind of activism. It was connected with especially veteran movement after First World War. It's a big topic, I know, but generally I was basing on diaries of nurses, diaries of doctors, diaries of people with disabilities of that time. And personally, I'm focused last time on Silesia, which is interesting region in that time. Also because it was the most industrialized area. And disability in people with disabilities in Silesia were considered as less worthy than general society. It was, in my opinion, it was connected with industrialization. Also also heavy industry in Silesia. Now it's of course changing because of transformation, because of the fact that many coal mines are closed, and many people don't see the need of such a hard work. And I also noticed when I was reading those articles about experiences of daily life, because I noticed that in those articles about Silesia, disability wasn't mentioned directly. Yes, I'm reading on the chat. Yes, it's very contextual, very depending on the region. Also, I mentioned Kaziów. Kaziów was coming from family living in former Eastern Poland. I'm not sure how to translate it. Kresy. Was living close to Lviv, Stanisławów, which is now Ukraine. And also his neighbors were coming from this settlement. They moved to Western Poland, close to Wrocław. And he also noticed this interaction between Ukrainian people, for example, in that time. interaction with other minorities. And it's interesting that, for example, disability was considering as a barrier in the case of marriage. It was also interesting. In that times, maybe we don't think about it more deeply, and I noticed we don't see this how big social change we experienced since 1980s, 1990s. For example, I saw in one article about Silesia, daily life in Silesia during communist times, during socialism Poland. The words of older lady living in, who was native Silesian, and she told that for everyone, marriage was ultimate. It was the, I would say, default state of life. Of now it's differently, and if disability was appeared, it was considered as some barrier from being married. So it also was considered as some lower standard in that society. So it's very, so it's really, really, I would say, I don't see Monica who wants to come to me. Okay, now I see her. Okay. Sorry for this break, but it was some technical break. So it's really contextual, highly intersectional topic, depending on region, depending on social class, depending on decade, depending on environment. So it's really, really big topic. And I would say that in that times in Poland, there were more gaps, more clashes than just religious, secular. There were more and more clashes.
Thank you. And Kamila?
Hello, I was a little bit late for this seminar. Couldn't make it on time, so I missed first 10 minutes. I'm very sorry for that, and maybe you mentioned this at the beginning. That's why I'm explaining. But I have like 2 comments and 1 question as my predecessor. One comment, what I would argue with your argument that most of people, majority of population in post-war decades lived in rural regions, whereas this is true for interwar time, and early 1940s, this was only over 30% of people lived in cities. The first big wave of urbanization was 1950s and then 1970s. So within this period of time, actually masses of people moved from rural regions to big cities and received education and so on and so on. So I think that this should be mentioned. And 2 questions. I find it interesting what you said when at the beginning of your talk, that disability was very often associated with infectious diseases. Why? Because of course there are diseases like you mentioned polio or this tuberculosis with severe side effects that cause disability or certain disability, but there are not so many actually. Especially in Poland, like for instance, leprosy is practically unknown since Middle Ages in our region. So, which also leads to disability. So I find this very interesting. How come disability became to be associated as infectious diseases were seen as the most common cause? And my question now, in this narrative that surrounds disability, I'm not talking about people's diaries or of their personal experience, but the narrative that mirrors the fear of disability. Is there a eugenic argument? Because, well, since you also mentioned that disability was there were certain troubles to get married, for instance, it was seen as an obstacle. In eugenic discourse in pre-war time and also post-war time, that was quite clearly indicated that, well, certain disabilities, those who are hereditary, which are hereditary, they are obstacle for marriage and so on. And I would be interested in this eugenic or hereditarian argument was more frequently repeated in the writings. So yeah, that you examined. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you also for this information about urbanization in post-war Poland. I would say that when we are talking about these eugenic arguments in post-war Poland, it's not that society was totally isolated from the eugenic ideas. There is no research. I didn't find any research about it. But from my personal experiences, when I'm talking, well, even when I was younger and I was talking with some older people, for example, I know when I was talking about autism spectrum with some representatives of those generation, people born in 1940s, 1950s. And one of those persons told to me, oh, please don't speak to me about people with autism. They are children of alcoholics. This person told it to me. And no argument was convincing that reality is different, that it's not like she's thinking, but I saw there's a lot of prejudices. Maybe even not directly told, but in some private discussion, I saw a lot of prejudice from that period. In my opinion, it was connected with Stalinist propaganda. Propaganda which was talking about everyone must be healthy, everyone must be physically strong, everyone is building Poland after war. That is interesting. There is no research about it, about how older people raised in that time considered people with disability generally. But from my own personal experience, I saw that there is a lot of prejudice.
Well, I don't know, may I quickly, don't know if there are any other people waiting. Well, since you mentioned Stalinist propaganda, well, actually then eugenic argument would be excluded because as we know, the 1950s marked, or early 1950s marked actually this fundamental criticism of Western biology and hereditarian ideas. Lysenkoism and these concepts that environment may do everything. This was the dominating discourse. So then eugenic and hereditarian concepts that would rather not surface. Prejudice is, well, obviously different thing, and well, this idea that these children are alcoholics or social pathologies that you also mentioned, but what's interested me was that whether this expressis verbis or any authors would refer to heredity as the as one of the elements that somehow.
No, I didn't notice. I didn't notice such narratives in those books I mentioned.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for Alicja for your lecture, and to you all for the discussion. The time for the lecture is ending right now, and I would like to give us all these 15 minutes for recharging and grabbing some coffee or tea. And I invite you to the very same room, Zoom space, for a workshop that Maria Bokur will lead. She's already with us. Hello, Maria. And so let's see in 15 minutes in Eastern European time, that will be 4:45. You can just switch off your cameras and microphones, and we'll meet here in a few moments. Thank you so much, Alicja, and thank you all for attendance.
Okay.